Okay, this is software that emulates a TI-83 Plus calculator. It has all the same buttons as a TI-83. 84 looks pretty much identical, different colors maybe. This is primarily the calculator that I'll be using to show you a few things throughout the textbook. So we have a few problems to the left here, and I'm just going to evaluate those. You notice the first one is just 45 times 3. We can use parentheses if we want to. I'm just going to enter the 45. I'll just hit the multiplication symbol times 3. And to evaluate it, you just hit enter. And that's kind of nice because this 135, the answer now is stored in the calculator. In fact, there's a couple things stored in the calculator. The first thing, if you look down here above the minus sign for negative numbers, we have in yellow answer. That means we can call up our previous answer by hitting second and then answer. And it'll just say NAS, but it's referring to the 135. I can hit enter and it'll tell me what that previous answer was. Above the enter is entry, and I can pull up things. There's the last thing I had, which is answer right above it. If I hit second and entry again, it pulls up the 45 times 3, and that I can go and edit. So I can just backspace here, and maybe I want 45 times 4 instead. I can type over it, hit enter, and now I have that result. This screen that we're on is called the home screen, and it'll be referred to frequently in text or even by myself. I'm going to go ahead and clear the home screen and do the next calculation. The next calculation is just multiplication and division from left to right. And so I'm going to do this in chunks so you can see how we can do this pretty easily. I'm going to do, because all these parentheses kind of get confusing, they get hard to deal with. So a faster way is to start on the left here, and we'll go 63.2. We'll hit times 48. We'll get an answer. That's the answer of the first two that I've multiplied together. Then I'll hit times. It'll take that answer, 3, and I'll hit enter. And then I'll take that final answer and just divide it by 6. And so it saves me a lot of time working with parentheses by doing a small calculation and then getting an answer, then using that answer for my next calculation. Let's clear the home screen. In the next example, we've got 8/3 a fraction. And lots of students have a question, how do I enter fractions on these calculators? They're used to the other calculators that are not graphing calculators. Well, they assume that if you are smart enough to be using a graphing calculator, you should know how to deal with a fraction, because fractions are just division. 8 divided by 3 is 8 divided by 3, and that's 8/3. If I hit enter, it'll convert that into a decimal. Now you'll notice here in this decimal it is 2.66 repeating until it gets to this 7. That 7 is a rounded 7. This should be a 6, and the next one is also a 6, and so it had to stop and it rounded it right here. And we know that because 8/3 is 2 and 2/3, and 2/3 is 0.6 repeating. So you do have to be careful here. It only holds, it looks like 3, 6, and 9 decimal places. And so watch for those patterns and say, hold it, I wonder if that is really a 7 or not. Another neat feature, though, is if we want to check it, is we're used to having a fraction button on our calculator. Well, in TI-80's lineup of calculators, most of those unique features are under this math button right here. If I choose math, you'll see I have a number of options: fractions, decimals, this is cube something, cube root something, some other index is what that's called, like a 3rd root or a 5th root or a 6th root. In this case, we're talking about fractions, so I'm going to choose number 1 here. I can choose number 1 by hitting the number 1, or since 1 is highlighted, I'll just hit enter. And by choosing that, what it's done is taken the last answer and says, I'm going to make you into a fraction. And if you hit enter, it'll return that 8/3. That brings us to the next problem, this 0.16 with the 1/6 repeating. If I just enter the 0.16, notice I don't have to put the 0 in front of it. I can tell it math and choose number 1, make me a fraction, and it's going to give me 16/100ths, which simplifies to 4/25ths. But that's not the actual decimal that I have. What I have is 0.16 repeating. To enter that in your calculator, you just have to enter a series of 16s. Now, I'm never quite sure how many it takes, so I always make sure I put in plenty of repeats. That should be enough. Then I tell it math, fraction, and it tells me it's 16/99. I can hit math again, and let's turn that back into a decimal number 2, and you'll see what happens. That's the 0.16, and the 1/6 is repeating. So fractions are under math, and you need to deal with them. Let's see how we deal with this next fraction. We've got 7 times 6 over 3 times 2. I'm going to deal with it by doing the numerator first, 7 times 6. Get an answer for the top, so I know that's all calculated. Now I'm going to get an answer, or divide that by the denominator, 3 times 2. Now, sometimes we get lazy with calculators, and I'll see students type in 3 times 2. We know it's 6, so your best move is just type in 6. Don't let the calculator do all that work for you. Now, if it was something you didn't know, let's go ahead and use our second entry. There's my 7 times 6. Let's say now I want to divide that by that denominator, so I'll stick the denominator in parentheses and tell it 3 times 2. Now I've taken the numerator, which is 42, and divided it by the denominator. Now we have 3 times 10 to the 8th. If you haven't used that in science classes yet or math classes yet, that is scientific notation. 3 times 10 to the 8th is what, 30 million? 300 million. It's a really big number. Okay? One way we could enter 3 times 10 to the 8th is as follows. We could go 3, hit the times button, hit the second 10 to the, and enter an 8. 3 times 10 to the 8th. And there it is, a really big number. That's a lot of steps. It's not the only way we could do it. We could also do it this way. 3 times 10. We could use this caret right here, and that would be 3 times 10 to the 8th power. Gives us the same result. This scientific notation, however, is so common that our calculators, almost all of them nowadays, have a shortcut for it. And on a TI-80 3 and above calculator, it's right above the comma. You'll see that EE. That double E is for scientific notation. And when you use that, it saves you quite a few keystrokes. If I want 3 times 10 to the 8th, all I have to enter is 3, second, E, E. Okay, it only shows one E, but that E stands for times 10 to the, and I just type in the exponent, or the power of 10. And that is 3 times 10 to the 8th, written in computer talk. And you'll see it's the same number. Even if we have a 3.5 times 10 to the 8th, or times 10 to the, I'll do 6, so you can see it's a shorter number. Okay, that's 3.5 million, because 10 to the 6th power is 1 million. So that's how we deal with scientific notation. One thing you have to be careful of is that if we have a number that's really, really big, 3 times 10 to the 9th times 5 times 10 to the 83. Notice how our answer comes out. Okay, this is 6 times 10 to the negative 75. So watch out. Sometimes, especially if we had a lot of decimals in front of this thing, in front of this number, you might have that E at the very end and not notice it. So make sure you look at the entire number to make sure it isn't times 10 to some power. And then the last example I want to show you is 3 times 10 to the 8th times 2. Our calculators treat this scientific notation as a single entity. And what that means is that is one number, and now if I hit times 2, it doesn't take the 8 times 2. It takes the 3 times the 2. So it treats it like this 3 times 10 to the 8th is one number, and then takes that whole number times 2. And that's all for right now. Oh, I was going to really quickly show you a bonus thing, how to graph things. We'll cover this quite a bit in more detail later on. But to graph things, it's relatively easy. Up at the top, these blue buttons are generally what I call the graphing buttons. If you hit y equals, you can see we have plot 1. This is for graphing points. Same with plot 2 and plot 3. Those are for graphing just individual dots or points on a graph. These, y1 through, I think it goes down to y0. You can scroll through and look. Those are for putting in equations. And we don't want to go too much into equations right now, but I will show you a very simple one. 3, then I have to put a variable next to it, which just is a letter to represent a number. And I'll put +1. And once you've entered an equation, you can go to window if you want to. In general, you never have to touch window. Window tells you that the x is going to go from a certain value to another value, what you're stepping by, and so forth. But usually you go y equals, you jump to zoom, and in general you always start with number 6 here. And again, you could arrow down to 6, but it's easier just to hit button 6, and it'll automatically graph that line for you. There's a bunch of things we can do from this standpoint. The reason I pointed this out to you now, this, by the way, I'm going to go back to y equals. It's already saved in there. If I were to hit graph, it's going to pull up that graph again. The reason I point this out is because many times we may run into problems and you go, I have no idea what that is. But it really doesn't matter in some cases if you know how to graph some little basic stuff on here. This is y equals 3x squared. I'll just follow the same procedure, zoom 6 it, and I should get this shape right here called a parabola. So if you know how to do just a little bit of graphing, it can help you out of some difficult situations by looking at a picture of what the information is telling us. To get out of this screen right here, obviously y equals takes me back to this, but you can always go to second and then quit, and that takes you back to the home screen. Second, quit. If I'd had anything there like 999 times 6, and I went in, I did some graphing things, as soon as I go second quit, it takes me right back to the information that I had. And that's our introduction to the calculators that we will be using in class.